In today's tutorial, we're going to get started with geoprocessing tools, which manipulate spatial data. And the first geoprocessing tool we're going to learn is called a buffer. So in order to learn about buffers, we're going to use a very large data set in New York City called MapPLUTO, which contains lots of data on every single tax lot across the city. And there are almost 1 million tax lots in the city, so this is going to be a very large data set. So to download MapPLUTO, I will type in MapPLUTO into my search engine and click on the first result, which should be the New York City Department of Planning website. And I'm going to scroll down to MapPLUTO, or the spatial version of the data set, and I'm going to download the shapefile that says shoreline clipped, as opposed to also including portions of tax lots that are underwater. So downloading this data set, you can see that it is 136 megabytes zipped. So just keep in mind how large it is. You might want to delete the raw data after you're done working with it. So now that it's downloaded, I'm going to drag it into my project folder. And like I've done in some previous tutorials, I'm just going to drag in the zip file. But because this zip file contains many different files inside of it, I'm going to click just here on Polygon and add that layer. You can see that other things end in PDF. That's not what I need. So MapPLUTO is going to start loading. It's happening relatively fast on my computer, but this can take a while. And if you ever want to pause the rendering process because it's taking a long time, you can unclick this check mark down here. But I will let MapPLUTO fully render. Next up, I'm also going to add subway stations as a layer to the map. So I've just added it to my project folder, and I'm dragging in the shapefile. It appeared below MapPLUTO, and I'm going to put it on top. So now I'm going to select my subway station layer, and I'm going to navigate to Vector, Geoprocessing Tools, and Buffer, the first one. A buffer creates a new vector shapefile with a given radius around each feature in the input data set that you're providing it. So here my input layer is the subway stations, and I'm going to input a distance of 0.5 miles or a half a mile. I'm going to make sure that the end cap style is round, and I will run the buffer. And so it's going to produce a buffer around every single subway station in New York City. These are showing up as individual features for each one of those, but I actually in this case want all of my circles to be merged together into one single polygon, so I can see all of the area that falls within a half-mile radius of any subway station. So I'm going to remove this temporary layer that was created and go back to my buffer window where it's switched over to the log, but I'm going to navigate back to the parameters window, and I'm going to check off this dissolve result option, and I'll click run again. And now it's created a polygon with one single feature with all of the buffers around each subway station merged or dissolved together. And this has created a temporary layer by default, but I can save this by right-clicking and then going to export and save features as. And I'll make sure it's in the right project folder, and I'll call this subways buffer 0.5 mile. Save, and add save file to map is selected. So now I can remove the temporary file that was created, and I'll just drag the buffer down below subway stations so that you can still see the subway stations at least for a moment. So what I want to do next is I want to select all of the tax lots in New York City that fall within 1/2 mile of a subway station. In order to do that, I'm going to use another feature called Select by Location to select all of the MapPLUTO tax lots that fall within the buffer that I just created. And so in order to visualize this a little more easily, I'm going to zoom in closer into my map. And I'm going to make the buffer layer mostly transparent so that you can see through it. I'll change the opacity to 40%. And now I'm going to go to another tool called Select by Location, which is in the Research Tools menu under Vector. And in Select by Location, I'm going to say Select Features from MapPLUTO, where the features are within or intersect, and then the comparison layer is that buffer. And I'm going to run the function. Given how large the MapPLUTO layer is, it might take a little while to run that function. And you can see that any tax lot that either intersects or falls completely within that buffer is now selected, which I can see even more clearly if I turn off the buffer temporarily. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to export the selected features as a new layer by going to export and then save selected features as. Now, there are many attributes to the Pluto layer, and I don't need all of those. So I'll start with deselect all. And then what I'm going to keep are the attributes called units res and land use. I'm going to call this Pluto 0.5 miles of subway and save it to my map. Now I've got another new layer of the tax lots that were selected using the select by location feature. I'm going to turn off MapPLUTO and my subway buffer so that I can see just those tax lots that were selected. You can also change the symbology of my subway stations to see those a little more clearly by making them size 10 and more of a bright yellow. So the research question that I'm trying to answer now is how many residential units fall within a half-mile radius of a subway station in New York City. Now I'm going to run some basic statistics to see how many total units there are. So I'm going to use a tool called Basic Statistics for Fields by navigating down here to my processing toolbox, which if I don't see it, I can find by going to View, Panels, and then Processing Toolbox panel. And in there, I can type in the word statistics. And under vector analysis, I'll see basic statistics for fields. So here I have my input layer as Pluto 0.5 miles subway, and I want to calculate statistics on the field units res. I'll run this, and it's going to switch over to the log and output the results right here. So I've got these basic statistics, and I have the sum here. So the sum is 2,769,741 units. Now I'll copy over that number into a text file just to keep track of it. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the same statistics, but on all of MapPLUTO, so I can see how many total residential units there are in the entire city. So I'll use that original MapPLUTO layer and the same field of units res. And I will run basic statistics again. So now I have the total sum, which is 3,641,524 units. And I'll copy and paste that into my text file as well. And now I can do simple division to see what share of residential units in New York City are within 0.5 miles of a subway station. So by dividing the first number I got by the second, I can see that 0.76 or 76% of residential units in New York City are within a half mile of a subway station. I've now zoomed out so I can see just about the full map. I have my subway stations turned on. I reduced the size of the points a little bit. And I've also got the buffer showing, as well as the tax lots that intersect with the buffer or fall within it. One thing you might notice is that some of the tax lots that were included in that 0.5 mile radius fall partially or largely outside of that radius. So let's look again at how that looks on a smaller scale. So you can see that the buffer here goes only partway into these tax lots, but the entire tax lot is included. So this analysis that we just did was largely to calculate the number of residential units that fall within that 0.5 mile buffer. But let's say you don't want to have these tax lot portions that fall outside of the buffer. So in that case, you would use a geoprocessing tool called clip instead of select by location like we used earlier. So I'm going to show you how you would do that. I'm going to turn off my MapPLUTO 0.5 mile subway layer, and I'll turn back on the original MapPLUTO layer. So now you can see the tax lots for all of New York City, not just the ones that are within or intersect with the buffer that I created. And instead of going to vector and then research and select by location, instead I'm going to go to geoprocessing and clip. And my input layer is going to be MapPLUTO, and my overlay layer is going to be my buffer. And I'll run that. And that could take a while to run, again, because MapPLUTO is quite large. But let's take a look at what it looks like when it's done. So I'm going to turn off my subway's buffer, and you can see that this clipped layer is another color on top of the pink MapPLUTO. And if I turn off MapPLUTO, now you can see that the tax lots that fall within that 0.5 mile buffer are clipped to the exact shape of the buffer, which you can see even more clearly if I turn the buffer back on. And so the clipping tool is sort of like a cookie cutter that you're cutting around one layer of your data based on another layer of data. And it can be really useful when you have one layer that's larger than another. For instance, let's say you have data on all of New York State, but you want to clip it to just New York City. You can use the clip tool in cases like that. It can be very useful to get your data into the shape that you want it, and also particularly for designing your map for your external audience and getting it ready to export.